How is justice enforced? We might find at the bottom of the justice system we arise to the officers, the police officers, men and women which every day sacrifice their own individual lives in order to assure peace is maintained within society. According to the individual police officer's moral compass and their awareness to situation which they may have been gained experience from, you could actually find that the more a police officer is able to diffuse or hold their ground in any face of a situation, the more experience resulting in them experiencing those situations multiple times. Police officers themselves go through a tremendous amount of stress in their lives. We as people don't often thank the police. We might fear as a result of possibly being of a possible suspect if we once were found to be of a suspecting nature. Imagine now if a police officer in their own based of being an officer, if, as an example, you break a law, you might speed too fast. They will pursue after you to give you a ticket, which from the said ticket is essentially meant to say, you can't go that fast, don't do it again. You will appear in court if you wish to dispute the fine that which I deem is fitting for the crime, according to multiple different factors that which are of a legislative measure. Ultimately, these police officers don't just pursue for simple crimes such as that, but these police officers are actively risking their lives every day to keep our streets cleaner, safer. And in the police officer, you might find that they themselves don't make all that much money, and yet they still pursue that role in society. They are of a protective nature. In that protective nature, once again, we arrive to these individuals sacrificing their lives for society, and they themselves experience a hate from society rather than respect. Beyond the level of the police officer, one might arise to the chiefs, the commissioners, and ultimately the overseeing body of municipal from the district. And upon the district, you then arise to the commissioner. The commissioner then is under the mayor. From the mayor, you might arise to then the province beyond the municipal government. And beyond the provincial government, you then arise to federal government, which federal law is to be essentially maintained within each provincial, municipal, district, commissioner. And you see this being infinitely reflected from the very base layer to the very high within the law hierarchy, the justice system. Ultimately, when I am speaking of the failure of the justice system, I would argue that the justice system at the police level is not of a failure. These individuals are of a respectable nature, and they sacrifice their lives on the line every single day to maintain the peace on our streets. Ultimately, the failure in the justice system, I would argue, is one step higher up, and another step higher up, and another step higher up. until ultimately we arise to federal law. In federal law, according to each individual's own interpretation of said federal law, they may arise to their own conclusion in their own deciding factors of how said federal law might be essentially maintained or enforced. However, in the lawmaking process, you might arise to particular legal action, and in legal action is regarding the interpretive statement beyond the definitive statement. And beyond the interpretive statement, you might have the action, that which is a response beyond the first means of the statement, the definition, the interpretation, and then the action, resulting in the legal document essentially arising to, once again, a law, a bill. And according to different laws and different bills, we then see once again at the individual interpretation the ability to interpret within their own moral compass, essentially, which way they might veer regarding that particular definitive statement. The definitive statement is meant to be what the law essentially means, the behavior resulting in the interpretation of what that particular behavior is, and beyond said interpretation, you then see the action, the corrective action, such as the proposition of the law. Ultimately, we are left at the interpretation, which is left once again at each individual of the justice system to interpret the definitive behaviors that in the interpretation you might see what a particular interpretation of the definition might be, and under that you will then see the corrective action. In a legal document, if laws are not based on wording meaning the same meaning, and if the worded document or the crafted document being the legal paper, such as the bill, you might find that once again, if the particular definition is not of a definitive definition, but a subjective definition, which is in itself reinterpreted in many different ways. Ultimately, upon creating a legal document, the same wording must be maintained at all levels, because in a definitive statement, if we cannot maintain the definitive language of each particular meaning for each particular word, and we infinitely allow the interpretation of what each word might individually mean to some than others, such as each individual self at each level of the federal, provincial, municipal, district, attorney. You might find that even beyond commissioner and below in their legal system of the Canadian justice system, you might find that if a legal document such as the passing of our laws and bills is not from a definitive definition, a singular meaning to each particular word, which in Latin a particular lawyer is to specifically pursue Latin in order to find that in Latin one word has one meaning, and said word is the actual meaning of said word. In order to create a legal document, a lawyer must essentially dive into Latin to find the initial root meaning of each word and maintain said wording within the entirety of the document in order to essentially assure that the individual interpretation collectively all leads us to interpreting it all once again collectively at the same meaning. In a subjective definition, which we currently see most laws are written around a subjective definition, which around the subjective definition you then see the individual interpretation of the subjective definition. At the subjective definition we then see the interpretation left at the individual, which can be interpreted exponentially however way they may see themselves interpret said wording, which then leads to the action. And in the corrective action we then see what the law proposal is. Now ultimately, in said systems, you might find that there are deciding people, individuals with deciding forces that in their own moral compass, once again, according to how they veer in their own, you could say, interpretation of the subjective definitions leading to the corrective actions, according to each individual within the justice system, we ultimately arise to individuals not ultimately carrying the same fundamental core set of values, that which each law is meant to represent. And in said moral compass, the law is meant to create an enforcement or encouragement of rewarding good behavior and punishing bad behavior. Ultimately, in this statement, I'm presenting before you a definitive meaning to what one particular word might mean. What might the word be? I leave you in your own mind to dive into one word that has a definitive meaning to yourself. Now, from said definitive meaning, you might arise to having a feeling behind that particular word. Behind said particular word, said particular meaning of that feeling arising as a result of that particular word is the definition of what that particular word means. That feeling. Imagine now if I was to say hatred, you could imagine hatred. If I was to say love, you could imagine love. You could feel it. In the wording, upon reading a legal document, a linguistic expert might find that in placing the understanding of meanings, such as the feeling that each word in its experience means, and if we cannot stick to the same meaning of what one particular word ultimately means, and each word is left at the individual definition, we cannot all collectively agree what said words mean, which ultimately leads to individuals not knowing how to read language anymore. You as a viewer, whether you are of a high-ranking government official or even a civilian, you might find in this particular conversation you might arise to learning how to actually read, placing the meaning, the feeling of each particular word into its existence, relating to said writing, connecting the feelings, the emotions, the meaning of each particular word, and in a legal document, said individual definitions are no longer definitive definitions. They are now subjective definitions, which result in, once again, the particular interpretation at the individual self leading to the individual self themselves deciding the factor of what might be the corrective action required to enforce said law, such as a sentencing. Thank you.